Welcome back to the Corporate Governance Program. I do hope you're enjoying the program. Now, our next guest is Sadia Khan. She's on the board of various organizations. Thank you very much for being on the program. When I look at your resume, you're on the board of Kashf Foundation, HBL Asset Management, First Microfinance Bank. You've also worked for the SCCP. You've done a lot of things. Thank you for being on the program and giving us some insight into corporate governance.
Thank you, Amir. It's good to be here.
When I was looking at your background, one of the things that I found very interesting was that you were actually involved in the development of Code of Corporate Governance right back in the early days when you've previously worked with the regulators. Can you tell me what it was like to develop or be part of the team that developed the code?
Amir, let me backtrack from my days as a regulator. My association with corporate governance actually dates back to about a decade when I was working with the ADB in Manila. We were faced with the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and in the aftermath of that crisis, a lot of the financial sector reform packages that we devised and rolled out for our member countries included a very important component of corporate governance. So the recognition was there of the importance of corporate governance in averting a widespread crisis in confidence. Fast forward to 2000, when I returned to Pakistan and joined the SCCP, one of the first tasks that was entrusted to me by the then chairman, Mr. Khalid Mirza, was to finalize the Code of Corporate Governance and to implement it. Having said that, the first draft had already been prepared by the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and a task force was formed at that stage comprising of the three stock exchanges, the two regulators, SCCP and the State Bank, as well as ICAP and ICMAP.
Okay.
And the task was really to take this forward, to hold public consultations and to take feedback and then to finalize the code. So we had a series of workshops and seminars in Lahore, Islamabad, Karachi, and a lot of the feedback that we got from the public was incorporated into the final draft. And the final version that came out was actually a much watered down version of what had originally been put forward for public debate. But as with the history of Pakistan, we preferred a moth-eaten, truncated code rather than nothing at all. So we went ahead and made them part of the listing regulations. After that, there was still a lot of work to be done because the awareness creation, the familiarity of the code was lacking. So we continued with a series of workshops and seminars. There was vociferous opposition to the code at that stage. What is satisfying at this stage is that some of the most vociferous opponents are now some of the most ardent supporters of the code. So I think we have made a lot of progress in the past 6 years.
Since we've been talking to a lot of people about the code, one thing that has been coming up again and again, that it's about time the code was revisited. It needs certain modification. It was good, and with due respect, it was good for 2002, but now in 2008, the code needs to be revamped and perhaps re-looked at. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that, Amir. In fact, as I just mentioned, it wasn't even adequate for 2002. It was extremely watered down from what we had proposed initially. And the time has come, I think, to drastically revise the code. You may be aware that a task force has been formed of various stakeholders, and they are looking at the code and attempting to revise certain provisions of the code.
Okay, and you're also an independent director on the boards of the companies that I previously mentioned. What do you feel about the role of independent directors, and where do you find people like yourself to be on boards?
Let me first define independent directors. Various institutions and various corporations define independence in different ways. The definition I like best is the one contained in the Hicks report, which came out in the UK in 2003 and formed the basis for the combined code of the UK. Their independence is defined as independence in character and judgment. There are no relationships or circumstances that can affect or perceive to affect the director's judgment. The Hicks report then goes on to specify certain conditions which fulfill the criteria of independence. The director should not have been employed by the company in the past 5 years, should not have been affiliated in any material way in the past 3 years, either as an auditor or a consultant, various other conditions. A lot of these conditions have been adopted by the State Bank in its revised prudential regulations last year. So we are getting closer to international norms of independence in Pakistan. As I was mentioning, Ahmed, there are certain areas where the contribution of independent directors is seen to be more important. One such area is strategic management. As independent directors, they bring a broader perspective from the respective areas of expertise. They're better able to monitor the performance of management against agreed upon benchmarks and in reporting of the performance to the board. Also, in terms of internal controls, audit committees, it is recognized internationally that the audit committees should be comprised largely of independent directors and chaired by an independent director. And finally, in the remuneration of executives, in the hiring or firing of senior management, and in succession planning. So these are all issues where the role of independent director is much more important. I think all policy decisions of the board have to be by the entire board, but it is these particular areas where the independent director can contribute much more.
And we have discussed this with some of our other guests as well. Obviously, independent directors bring a lot of value to the organization, but one of the challenges for organizations is to find good people, qualified people who can be on the board. How should organizations go about finding these directors, and where are these people?
Well, Amir, every time we try to introduce independent directors, the first criticism we face is, where are we going to get these directors from? If you create the demand, you create the supply. Last year, the State Bank stipulated that every bank and DFI has to have a minimum of 25% of its directors as independent directors. They've created the demand, the supply is coming. Most of these listed banks now comply with that particular provision. Similarly, for the corporate sector, I am an independent director on 3 privately held companies. And my name wasn't picked out of a hat. I mean, people knew me, I guess, professionally, and there was a reputation in the market which they want to capitalize on in terms of my independence and whatever personal characteristics. So I think there is a supply which needs to be tapped. There is a pool which being developed through the BDS of the PICG.
Board Development Series,
That's
which
correct.
IFC and PICG is collectively working on.
That's correct. I think by the end of this year, they should have about 200 certified directors. If you multiply that every year, 200, in 3 years' time, you should have about 600. And since there are about 614 listed companies, I think we'll have at least one independent director for each listed company if they can all act as independent directors.
One of the challenges that you face with independent directors, I suppose, is that when organizations are controlled by a handful of major shareholders, do you think it's easy to be an independent director in that situation?
If you remember that you have been chosen as an independent director because of certain reasons, i.e. your professionalism, your competence, your market reputation, your integrity, then it is these qualities that you want to maintain in your role as a director. So if circumstances arise where you feel that your independence is being compromised, you'll just opt out. It's as simple as that.
Okay, so you opt out, the company loses the independent directors, and we're back to square one, effectively.
Not really. I mean, when I say opt out, you say my bottom line was you don't compromise on your independence. And if the majority shareholders have been responsible for co-opting you on the board, it's in their interest and in your interest to maintain that independence.
And there are a lot of steps the companies can take in terms of having nomination committees and so on to make sure that once you are on the board, you do not leave for, unless it's some major disagreement, you don't end up leaving.
Absolutely.
So there's lots of steps, I suppose, to protect these independent directors. How has your experience been in terms of the organizations that you work with? Do you feel you've been able to deliver value and add value as an independent director?
Absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, some of the areas that we can contribute much better on is in terms of succession planning, in terms of strategic management, audit committees. And these are all areas that I've focused on in my role as an independent director. It just so happens that these companies happen to be extremely well run, so there's not much one can.
Well, Sadia Khan, thank you very much for being on the Corporate Governance Program and sharing some of your experiences with us. It's been great having you.
Thank you, Amir. It's good to be here.
That was Sadia Khan talking to us about corporate governance and the role of independent directors. That brings us to the end of our program. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure bringing it to you. We look forward to having you with us next week. Until then, take care.